good morning, good afternoon, good dawn, good wherever you find yourself and which part of the world or continent you find yourself in. This is the Power Series. It's another Sunday. It's an awesome one for me. I hope it's going well for you as well. And today's episode, we have a special guest who is going to share with us all about web services and our Power Automate. When we come back, we're going to get all into that. We're going to learn more about him, how he got into tech, and then he's going to share, some awesome stories about, creating web services in Power Automate. Stick and stay. When we come back, we're going to jump right into it. Awesome. I'm back. We're back, we're back, we're back, we're back, we're back, we're back. And yes, it is my single honor. Wait, hold on. Someone don't get too excited. Don't get ahead of yourself. Well, thank you so much for all of you who made it, time to watch us on the Powerful Dev Congress. Oh, okay. So just a sec. Let's see. Can you hear me now?
Little bit.
Okay. Okay.
Okay,
Okay.
I can hear you now.
Awesome. So, uh, sorry about that. So thanks for all those who made it in time to watch us on Powerful Dev. Yeah, that's just all for for today's announcement. Oh, let's just get right into it. Today on the show we have Steve. It's hold on, effect. Drum roll and a round of applause. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome to the show Steve. Steve, our live on. Welcome,
I've
Steve.
lost audio on you again.
Oh,
Okay,
really? What
I
is
think you're back.
happening?
Okay,
Okay, that was crazy. Can you hear me now?
I can't. I think when you have audio playing and audio effect, I can't hear you. I think that's the problem, but
Oh,
yeah.
hopefully it's
But I can hear you now.
awesome. Okay, hopefully because of live show will take um it heavier. Anyway, welcome again to the show. Thanks for honoring us, and it's a pleasure to have you. Um, tell us a
Great.
bit about
Thank
yourself.
you. Thanks for the invite. Great to talk to you.
Thank you, thank you. So, Steve, as always, people on my show want to know who my guests, what they do, where they've come from, how they got into technology, all that good stuff. So, take it all away. It's all yours.
Well, I guess it all started with the famous Commodore 64 computer when I was a kid. And we got one of those as a kid. We played with it. We wrote BASIC. And I just carried that as through high school, taking side classes in programming, although it had nothing to do with my main area of study. It was just kind of a side hobby. And in college, I took some more programming classes as electives. I was there for an economics accounting degree, but the side hobby and side jobs were all computer related, and managed the computer labs on campus. And in college, took summer internships doing help desk in New York, all sorts of computer stuff. So it's always been a completely side hobby of mine to be into software and programming and computers. And now I work with ERP systems primarily. Microsoft Dynamics. Previously, I worked with GP, and now I'm working
Okay.
with Business Central, the SaaS ERP solution. And you know, those are great products, but customers always need something else. They need some type of customization. They need an enhancement. They need to cover that additional bit of functionality for their business, or they need to integrate with a third party, move data back and forth. And so that's what I help with. I understand the core ERP, but my primary value I think I bring is integrating their ERP systems with other systems, other platforms, outside vendors, third-party services and solutions. So when it comes to connecting their ERP system to something else, that's when I get a call.
Awesome. Interesting. I'm curious to know. I mean, for those of you who are not familiar with what Dynamics was before, I'm curious. Comparing GP and Business Central, like what are some of the things you miss from from the old Dynamics? I'm sure there are things you probably miss.
Well, yeah, and it's not so much there are pros and cons, right? Every single system, old, new, doesn't matter. Every single system, every architecture, they have pros and cons. So it's not like system A is unequivocally better than system B. So for instance, Dynamics GP, fully functional, tons of customers use it, works perfectly fine. One of the things we got used to as consultants and customers working with Dynamics GP is direct access to the SQL Server, for instance. So it was traditionally an on-prem solution with an on-prem SQL Server. Well, when you move to the cloud, Microsoft is having to manage thousands of customers in Azure, right? They can't just hand the database keys over to every customer and have them messing with the database. So you don't have direct access to SQL Server. Well, you could say, well, that's a bad thing. But you know what? I'm perfectly okay not having to maintain a SQL Server.
Yeah.
I don't have to do backups anymore, right? I don't have to do disaster recovery. I don't have to deal with corrupted data. That's Microsoft's job. So that's fantastic. But, well, what about that report or that query or that web service that was able to access SQL Server directly? How do you do that in the new cloud SaaS environment? So it's not a bad thing. It's just, okay, we need to figure out a slightly different way of solving the customer requirements and providing value. And Power Automate just happens to be one of those tools.
Interesting. I mean, it's good that
Yeah.
you mentioned that, access to SQL, because the times that I've had this, issue, I remember I was actually talking to a company about, having some workloads in the cloud. And they were very poised. The very first question I was asked is, do we have access to our SQL database? I'm like,
Yeah.
well, the question is, what do you need access for? You have access to the
Right.
data. All the data you
Right.
need, you have access to it. So why are you worried about gaining access to the server itself? Think about it.
Great point.
It's being managed for you. All you need to worry about is your core business and your data. And then there's some head scratching moment, and then they find out, oh well, yeah, I guess we're gonna do it. It's interesting, this whole cloud revolution, and the way, I mean, apart from companies dealing with regulations and compliance issues that require them
Yeah.
to have data maybe on-prem or in a particular region. Personally, it's one of the problems that I've had to several times advise or kind of like educate clients on to tell them that, look, it's safer, it's safe in the cloud just as you keep it safe in your own premise. It just the best practices you follow. And I always give them this analogy that you can go buy the toughest and strongest security and armored door fix in your house with all the combinations. But what happens if you lock it and then you leave the combination on the key under the mat? And someone comes to pick the key and open the door. Are you going to say the door is no longer secured? No, it's your practices that made it not secure. So I keep giving this analogy. So it's interesting that you brought up the same thing. But that's cool. Well, today you have a lot for us in terms of web services and Power Automate. I guess our viewers are yearning, like let's get into it. So Steve, it's all yours. If you have any slides, any presentation, go for it. You're full now.
Sure. I'll just talk about some context, let's say. So in the Dynamics GP world, we have had cases where for our on-prem installation, the customer says, GP is working fine, but I need to expose this GP data as a web service to my e-commerce site. Or I have an e-commerce site and I need to receive orders from that e-commerce site and get them into Dynamics GP. And there are many ways to do this, but for the customers that ask for a real-time synchronous web service, that's a little bit challenging with the older Dynamics GP architecture. And they'll say, well, I want a modern RESTful JSON-based web service, and I want to use HMAC authentication. I don't want to use any other authentication methods. Okay, even if you say, well, GP has this feature or that feature, some of the more modern requirements around web service start to quickly exclude those options. So great. I was able to develop custom web services using ASP.NET Core, the latest Microsoft platform. Very cool. It's an amazing platform, and you can do some incredible things with it. The downside is it requires custom development, and it takes a fair amount of time, right? So you've got to have some type of web server infrastructure to handle those requests. You've got to have routing. You've got to have endpoints and controllers, and you have to have parsing of your JSON. You have to have model view architecture, data access layers, logging, email notification, error handling. The list goes on. So when you wrap up all that plumbing in order to get just a little bit of functionality, it's a pretty big project when you're doing those one-off in a custom basis. So what if there was a simpler method, right? So let me show my screen and just show a few examples that I've demonstrated. And there's my screen. Okay. Can you see my screen okay?
Yeah, we can see you live and clear. So
here is my Power Automate dashboard. And let's take a look at one example. I've created a Power Automate flow here that does something very simple. This is the most basic example of a custom web service in Power Automate. So Power Automate allows me to receive a web service request over HTTP. Once it receives that request, it can talk to, in this example, it could talk to anything, but in this example, it's talking to an on-prem SQL Server database. So this could be your internal ERP system, such as Dynamics GP. It could be some other system, a CRM system, warehousing, you name it. And it's able to call a stored procedure. It can run a query, call a stored procedure, interact with that database. It can then return the results of that query through the web service infrastructure. So let's just take a look at what that looks like. So it provides me with a public URL. I didn't have to spool up an IIS server or a web server or any type of VM. It just says, hey, great, here's your URL, copy it. I can paste that in there. I'm just going to refresh here. I already preloaded this, but you'll see here, this Power Automate flow is returning the data results for me. You can build this in less than 5 minutes using only your mouse, not a single line of code. You don't have to have any developer experience. You don't have to do any programming. It behooves you to understand what is going on, of course, right? Because you're exposing your data to the internet. So you have to take all of the precautions, and it really makes sense to understand what you're doing. But I, as a developer, rather than me spending 40 hours developing a custom web service, I can develop a fully functional, secure, robust web service without writing any code. So here we go. Great. You needed to expose your customer list to your e-commerce website so that you could have your customers available to create accounts, for instance. And then let's just take a look at another one. Going back to my flow list. So let's say, well, I'm concerned about authentication. Not a problem. I'm going to receive this request, but I'm going to require a body in the request. I'm going to require a payload. So not everyone can just call my URL. They need to submit some information to authenticate. And when they do, I can get the HTTP headers. This is what I would do in my custom web services, right? I can get a specific header key, and then I can validate that. And is that header key valid? Well, in the Power Automate flow, you see that I can check, well, is this GUID that the user passed in for their web API token, is it valid? And obviously, this is a very, very basic example where it's a hard-coded key, but you could retrieve that key from a database. You can have multiple keys. And this is header authentication. This isn't even body authentication. If I do have a valid header key, guess what? I can do a further layer of authentication. Did my website send this request in? And is that website key? It's a second layer of authentication. So I could have two keys. I can do whatever I want. Or was it my Salesforce authentication? I can have a separate key for every caller. And obviously, in a real solution, you would architect this differently. But here you see that my website can be authenticated with one web API key, and I can have a separate API key for my Salesforce integration. And if I have any security concerns, I can do a key rotation, right? So just like every other web API, Azure, you name it, you can reset your web API key and issue a new one. And if everything is good, great, I will proceed and I'm going to perform the actions that this flow is designed to do. I can branch out and get customers. I can, depending on what they requested, I can branch and get vendors. So with a single endpoint, I can branch out and handle multiple requests. And this only required my mouse and copy and paste from a clipboard. And I didn't have to write a thing. So this one is the advanced version that I can do in less than 30 minutes, have a publicly accessible custom web service with authentication, handle multiple request methods, hit multiple data sources, and return different payloads depending on what the caller is asking for. Let me tell you, when I first saw this, it was the mind-blown moment. Like, on the one hand, I was super excited because I was like, this is amazing. Yeah. On the other hand, I was kind of terrified. Wait a minute. My project of 40 hours just went to 30 minutes. My job just disappeared. But on the other hand, I'm thrilled by that because what value does the customer get by me writing custom code to do logging, right? To do endpoint request handling, to hopefully code security properly. And if I make one mistake, I can expose the data of my customer. Yeah. And then you have to host that server, open the network ports, all types of concerns around there. Yet here, it's point and click. And really, let me just zoom out. What can compete with this type of infrastructure? Now, with that said, you can hear the questions coming, right? Well, what about my enterprise grade security? Yeah. And what about this? And what about latency and logging? And well, you know what? I understand every single one of those concerns. But the more you dig into this and the more you see that this offers, like, oh, I have logging built right in. I have a 28-day run history. And look at this. I can see in a visual form every single step. I see that this request was received. I see it was a post. Look at this. I see what key was submitted. Oh, they wanted all customers that began with the letter E. I mean, try doing this with a traditional web service. You can log, but you have to write code to do that. Here are my inputs. Here's the URL key. Here's where I inserted a log entry into my Azure SQL database. So I have full logging. I can go back and say, oh, well, there's my request. Yeah. It's like super powerful. And hey, the Power Automate flow did that work for me. I just added one step to say log everything. Great. It said, okay, no problem. If you don't want to log in SQL, you can log to whatever, Azure Insights telemetry, Splunk, whatever connector you want, right? So I would say objectively, it's pretty hard to compete with this. Now, what are some valid limitations, right? Certainly this, just like any solution, doesn't do everything. One is latency. In my observation, Power Automate is not a super high performance, low latency, high volume solution. So if you've worked with Flow, you know that first request can sometimes take a while because it's having to on demand spool up those sessions in the background in the Azure Logic Apps infrastructure. So I totally get that. for the economy that you get out of this, you pay a performance hit, right? So if you need 100 millisecond, sub 100 millisecond latency, which is what I can deliver in an ASP.NET Core custom API, you're not going to get this in a Power Automate flow. So this needs to be high latency, non-synchronous, non-critical types of integrations. But you know what? There are a lot of those. When the warehouse tells me they shipped a package and it's some third-party warehouse and they're just telling me, hey, we shipped this order with this UPS tracking number for this customer, and here's what we shipped. I don't need to know that in less than 100 milliseconds, right? That can occur at 6 p.m., and that can take 30 minutes to import. I don't care. Great opportunity for a Power Automate flow. So with that said, I think there's some great opportunities for this. And I mean, here's the one that I did for receiving shipments from a warehouse. Okay. I can receive a request. It parses the JSON for me. I don't have to parse anything. Like, no JSON parsing. Are you kidding me? And for each item that warehouse shipped, great. Let me insert data into my table. Now people say, well, I don't want to expose my SQL Server to the internet via this Power Automate thing. Yeah. Great, don't. This is an Azure SQL database. It's not connected at all to my organization. It's not on-prem. You can spool up a separate Azure tenant that has nothing to do with your organization. And the only thing you could be risking is the data sent by your warehouse. And you manage that. You can download that. You can wipe those tables and truncate them nightly if you want to, if you're concerned about that security, right? So here, this is an example, also very cool. Power Automate can automatically branch its workload. So not everything has to be in series. Here I have it splitting the workload from a single request. I say, process my items that were shipped and process my tracking numbers in parallel. So it's kicking off multiple threads and spawning multiple processes to handle these two requests. Well, if I were doing this in ASP.NET Core, I'd have to do async and multi-threading, and it requires a fair amount of knowledge to do properly and to do reliably. Here, it's like, hey, spool up as many threads as you want, knock yourself out. It's saying, how much parallelism do you want? Well, let me let you spool up 30 threads. That's fine with me. So you can control how much parallelism you want on each process, depending on how much you want to pay for those resources, right? So you can control the concurrency and split this workload as much as you want. So here, Power Automate is simultaneously recording the items that were shipped and the tracking numbers that were shipped. And once both of those are done, it says, okay, I will group those together and I will send a success response. Pretty cool stuff. And I know you've worked with Power Automate with IoT. I mean, it's fantastic for that type of workload, right?
Yep. Yep.
So that's just the crash course. That's just the tip of the iceberg with these. Obviously, these are just kind of basic demonstrations of what you can do. But if you're familiar with what web services are, what you might want to do in an organization with web services, really, it's just a matter of getting creative with this Power Automate architecture and understanding, wait a minute, you mean I can seamlessly connect to multiple data sources without having to write code to connect to those APIs and parse their JSON, and just say, hey, magically, I have a connection to Oracle, to Salesforce, to Business Central, to Finance and Operations, to CRM, to my on-prem SQL Server. The sky's the limit.
Yep. You know, I was just when you're doing that, it just reminded me of my IoT session. You know, also used Power Automate, and you know, it was awesome.
Yeah.
But one of the questions we just had was, how did you connect your on-prem, you know, SQL to, you know, that's one of the questions that came And then the second one
Yep.
is what's the difference between doing that and doing, and setting up a custom connector? So I don't know if you can
Sure.
maybe.
Absolutely. So let me just show that now. So Microsoft has obviously anticipated this requirement, right? They sell SQL Server. It's a big popular product for them. So how do you get the Power Automate platform, which is fully in the cloud? You don't even have a tenant, really. You're just talking to some anonymous instance of a Power Automate flow. So how do you get that connected to your on-prem data? And they have this very clever tool launching now called the On-Premises Data Gateway. And very clever of them, it is free. Now, I do believe you need to have the appropriate Power Automate license to connect to this on-prem data gateway. So it's a premium connector, but you install this data gateway on one machine in your environment that can talk to the SQL services or SQL servers that you specify. And let me sign in here. Let me try to do this on, well, that's going to get involved. But the short answer is that I can have this installed. In this case, it's on my SQL server, and it simply talks to my SQL server. And it says, great, I see your SQL server. Let me expose that to Power Automate. So now if I go into Power Automate, let me go into one of my flows that talk to SQL Server. I simply add a SQL step, and it's connecting right now to my on-prem server. And you'll see here that it can see all of the different on-prem gateways that are tied to my account. So as long as I'm logging in with my same Office 365 or Power Automate login through Microsoft, it allows me to connect to all of these. These could be different machines. These could be on-prem and Azure VMs, you name it. And this is actually an Azure SQL database. It seamlessly shows up as a SQL connection. So whether you're on-prem, in the cloud, or totally SaaS through Azure SQL, seamless and transparent to the user. So that was number one of how do I connect to SQL? It's just like any other data source. And once you do that, I have my server connection here. It automatically interrogates my databases and knows which databases are available. And then it lets me see, depending on whether I'm querying my tables or stored procedures, it lists them for me. Look at that. It says, hey, which one do you want? I want this stored procedure. And even better, it knows what the results of that stored procedure look like. It's already done the homework to scan that stored procedure. And it says, well, do you want the body, the output parameters? And in the case of something like a table, it can even show you the fields in that table and let you select them individually. So it's done all of that work. So that was the on-prem SQL connector. And sorry, I forgot. What was the second question?
So the second one was trying to ask what's the difference between, creating this workflow and then custom connectors?
Okay, so custom connectors are my experience with them. I'm not a pure expert, but for instance, if I go into this connectors area here in my Power Automate dashboard, I guess, I can choose from one of the gazillion, I think there are well over 300 different out-of-the-box connectors now. These are both Microsoft and third-party. I can choose from them. So maybe I want Motivate. I don't know what that is, but they've created a connector. Office 365 connectors, Azure DevOps. You can have all of those connectors, but let's say that, well, I have some custom solution or third-party solution that isn't available in this list. I can create a custom connector. Let's see. It's been so long, honestly. Custom connectors. And I can connect to a custom resource or an external resource through a web API. So here's the one example that I've done. I created an Azure function. I went into Azure Functions. I used VS Code and some C#. I created my own Azure function. Well, obviously, Microsoft doesn't know about my custom Azure function, so I'm able to connect to it through that Azure function URL. Just like a web service, I can point to it and say, hey, Power Automate, here is my function app that I want you to connect to. I exposed it as an Azure API, and this is the endpoint I want you to hit. And it says, great. Okay, let's talk about that. How do you want to connect to it in terms of security? What is the definition? Like, what am I retrieving here? And I'm calling an Azure function that I call generate passphrase. That's the method. And that Azure function will generate a custom long passphrase for me that allows me to have just new passwords. So I expose this as something in a Power App. So I created a Power App that allowed me to generate custom passphrases. And I can even show that. And it says, great, I'm going to do a get, and I'm going to pass in these parameters. And, you know, the end user, if they're fairly technical, they don't need to really write code. This is an art in itself. Creating a custom connector, I have learned, I have great respect for the people who know how to do this well. This took me a while. So this isn't your typical just end user walk in the park wizard. This does require some expertise, but no programming, right? As Belinda Allen famously says, this is citizen developer territory for sure. She's done many custom connectors. So I was able to figure it out, and it wasn't a programming skill. It's just figuring out this process. And if you're familiar with Swagger, that's kind of an API language that helps you define and publish your API. It can consume those Swagger endpoints to say, great, I've discovered your API, and maybe you're using Shopify or, you know, some common SaaS platform. If they expose a Swagger endpoint, great, Power Automate or Power Platform custom connector, it just consumes and says, great, thank you. I've discovered everything I need to know. I'll take care of it from here, right? So very nice. And then it even has a test. So I can say, well, let me specify test values here, and let me test it and see what happens. And so when I do that, and this is totally on the fly, I haven't used this in a while, so let's see what happens. Live demos, as you know, it's tempting fate. So I'm going to go in my Power App, and using that very same custom connector, I got Power Apps to talk to my custom Azure function that's exposed via Web API. Let me go over to my apps, and I'm going to go into my Passphrase Generator app. I'm going to play it, and we will all collectively cross our fingers around the globe at the same time. And I'm going to say, I want a custom passphrase with at least 3 words. And each word, I want a maximum of 8 characters, because, you know, some corny websites, they have password length limits. I want to include numbers from 0 to 99. I want to include symbols. I'm going to click on generate. What this Power App is doing is it is calling a flow, and that flow is then calling Azure functions. It's returning all of that back to my Power App. And Power Apps is recording that passphrase. So here I was able to generate my custom passphrase just the way I wanted it. And it took 5 seconds for Power Apps, 3 seconds for Flow, and 1 second for my Azure function. So this was both a test app for me, and I wanted to measure latency across the entire chain from Power Apps to Power Automate to Azure and back. And here I'm able to do that. And so I can generate anything. And maybe a website doesn't allow symbols. Great, not a problem. I'll just click that button again. I have a shorter one. So this was a cool project. So I had developed this in .NET for my Windows desktop, and I use it all the time. Anytime I need a new passphrase for some random website, I use this to generate a strong password, because I like the words and the numbers and in a way that I can read it. And because I regularly have to retype this, maybe I'm on a mobile device or my kid's device where I actually have to type it in. If it's totally random, that is a nightmare. But at least now I see Boatable 79, Gallant 61, Zambia 13, much easier to work with. And I can change it up however you want to do it. So this was an example of me learning how to do a Power App. Okay, so that was a my learning a custom connector. And that was kind of tricky. I tried different ways. That was the way I found, but there are different ways to connect to Azure Functions and have a custom connector. But I went the kind of the Power Apps to Flow to Azure Functions route.
Interesting. So I think one another question that came in was about pricing. Like, so how much does it cost, doing all that, thing in Automate compared to just, regular API?
So as many people will say, I am not a licensing expert, and trying to keep up with Microsoft licensing in my experience is a losing battle. I don't know what the exact pricing is, but it's pretty cheap, whatever it is. Let's say it's $30 a month or whatever that price is. You're not having to host anything. You have nothing on-prem, and you have no maintenance. So you have a zero footprint solution, 100% SaaS. And in the case of Power Automate and Azure Functions, it is cycles based or request based, right? It's consumption based. It's not like you're having to pay a fixed $100 a month, whether you use it or not, and have capacity limits. It's pretty much consumption based, is my recollection. And really, for a small organization that isn't going to be doing 1 million requests per month, this is more than adequate, right? And when you could factor in the savings of not having to have the developer write code, it's a real win-win for most organizations. So.
Oh, awesome. Yeah. I mean, it's light bulbs are going off. I have been a user of, of Power, Automate myself, doing a lot of things. One of the questions that I keep getting is obviously cost and licenses, which you've spoken on.
Yep.
And then the other one was, and someone also has the same question, was how do you connect your on-prem stuff? In terms of like total security, and then like production systems, how often have you used this particular approach on production environment?
Personally, because I am not the the Shane Youngs of the world, right? I'm not a Shane Young, so this for me is a supplemental technology, and I'm exploring it to see if it can fill gaps for my customers. So I have not yet used this in a production environment to solve a real world problem, but these examples are my customers' real world problems that I solved using some other method. They are being replicated here. So in a non-business critical requirement that can handle the latency, and the world won't end if a request doesn't get fulfilled or if an error occurs, I'd be perfectly comfortable doing this. And I would wager if this was done properly, one of these Power Automate flows could be more secure technically than me trying to deploy an IIS web server and implement security, right? For me to claim that I can implement perfect security on an IIS web server with a custom web service, boy, that is asking for trouble. And if you've ever read about exploits of web services by professional hackers and criminals, the skill level is really, I mean, we're talking NSA grade hacking there. And really the simplest mistake, one missed Windows update, one misconfiguration of IIS, one incorrect configuration setting or bad encryption setting in my custom code, and I've just handed out the keys to the kingdom right there. If I forget to change the SQL Server security or the web service security during deployment from dev to prod, one mistake and it's game over. Here, your chances of making those mistakes, I would say, are less. And the ability to isolate this from your production network, wherever that may be, keeping it completely isolated from production, you can have a complete air gap of sorts between your Power Platform. You could have a Power Platform to an intermediate isolated Azure data structure, whatever that is, and then you could have asynchronous jobs to pull that in. I would bet any day on that architecture over an on-prem self-hosted DIY custom web service. Like, just the odds are against you, no matter how you look at it.
Yeah, just like, security experts will tell you that don't try and implement your own security. Like use trusted, you know, well-built systems. Don't go reinventing the wheel when it comes to security. And talk of patch, I was just reading an article today about a Windows update that I think I think the whole US there's I've forgotten the name of the institution, but it was kind of like giving an ultimatum to all its state departments to make sure they run
Yeah,
that update. So yeah, like you're saying, you have to worry about even if you're building an IIS, if you're building C# and all that, you're worrying about hosting it. Like you said, you're worrying about making sure you set the correct configurations. You're worrying about a whole lot of things. So I think I'm on the same boat with you when it comes to, do I go for, in this case, low code kind of thing, compared to, I mean, again, like you mentioned, the scenarios might be different, but it gives us the
right.
ability to do both of it, which is fun, because you
Yep,
could have still done the C# in functions, right? And then
yep.
exposed it here. So in that,
There you
yeah,
go. There you go. Get your web service off-prem,
yeah,
keep it in the cloud, Azure Functions, Azure Applications, right?
yeah,
And so, um, uh, relevant story. Last week before last, I was troubleshooting an issue. Something wasn't working right. It had to do with Business Central Docker containers, and I was getting this strange error. Well, the Microsoft employee who manages that, he was kind enough to reply. He's like, "You're running a really old Windows version." And I thought, no, not me. I
yeah,
run Windows Update. I'm
yeah,
responsible. One of the Windows updates had failed. It prevented every other Windows update from
running,
completing.
yeah,
It had been that way for 6 months, and I didn't know it. So I'm running on a out of the box RTM version of Windows Server 2019 without knowing it. I had no idea. And it's not like I did anything obviously wrong.
yeah,
I just hadn't checked that server, didn't realize it was stuck. So I had months worth of security patches that
hmm,
had to be applied. It happens. Now, do I want to take that risk with my on-prem data?
no,
So when someone says we do on-prem better than
yeah,
Microsoft, tell me you haven't made that same mistake at
sick,
least
yeah,
once. Yep. So I totally empathize. It's really hard. The more that I can outsource reliably and comfortably, and guess what? When I'm doing this in Azure Functions and Power Automate and Power Apps, the skill level required to get there is lower as well,
yeah,
right? And so you don't have to have the same level of developer, citizen level developer handling these things. Is it nice to have those skills? Sure. You understand all the components, you understand what's going on, but you don't have to have it. It's not going to be a deal breaker for your solutions in many cases.
that's that's a lot. That's a lot for this show. We've learned all
Yep.
these things, and we've delved into some best practices and things to look out for. So what would be your next steps for someone just watching us? I want to try this out. What's the next steps?
There are so many resources around the Power Platform, as you know. I would say start with a real world business requirement that you have. Find something that is annoying you. Like, I get this email, this alert, and I have to deal with some mundane problem, or I'm having to take this data, export it to CSV, and email it to Sally. Why am I doing this? Try to do a Power Automate flow to take care of that problem. Power Automate can export that data, save it to a OneDrive folder or a share, or email it off. It can send you with alerts, or it can deal with those email alerts. Find just some small granular tasks that you don't like to do
Yeah,
and try to automate it, right?
yeah,
And there are the boot camps. There's App in a Day. There's Power Platform, the Power Platform conferences, global conferences that they have all over the world. There are so many resources. Just take a look at what's going on either on Twitter, on the Microsoft event schedule. Everything is virtual now, of course, but so many resources to get started with Power Automate, Power Apps, Power BI, the entire Power Platform, and get connected.
And also to add to that, make sure you join your local user groups because there's also a lot of, skill in there. People that have been doing it for a while now will be there to help you, if you have any blogs. So that's very important. Well, Steve, before we call it a day, finally, what's your advice to people coming into technology and then people considering the Power Platform?
Boy, that's a good question. It is often hard when you're starting from scratch, right? So I think it's hard to give advice on exactly how to do this, but if you're able to find someone that can help mentor you along, I think that really goes a long way. I mean, there are blog posts and there are videos, but when you're alone and trying to do something from scratch, as you I'm sure know, when you're trying to figure out something new, you're entering a new group, a new community. If you can join a user group and meet some people who can help you out, just give you some pointers, really that goes a long way. And that's very much part of the MVP community and helping people out and sharing. And to the extent you can find someone to help mentor you, whether that's an individual or a user group, definitely try to go that approach and be part of that community to learn. It'll make life a lot easier. And there's so many people willing to help in that regard. So I'd say that's my suggestion. Don't try to do it alone. It's so easy to get frustrated and to feel isolated. So find a group of people. I find Twitter to be fantastic. The Business Central ERP community is amazing. Yeah. We're collaborating and communicating all the time. I know the Power Platform, Power Automate, Power Addicts community on Twitter is just huge. Really, really helpful people there that constantly help out. So join a community in whatever platform or form you can and get started that way.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Steve. So before we end the show, as always, I am supposed to share with you the next person coming on the show. So let me quickly pull that up and let me share with you guys the next person coming on the show. I'm sure you all are going like, what, you have on the show? Yes. And where is that? Let's see. Where did I put that? Interesting. All right, so the next person we have coming on the show. So how do I do this? I like to do it in such a way that Steve, you can also see it. So I'm going to quickly hold on. Let's see if my output is on.
Also, I'll pull up the Periscope on my end. How's that?
Cool. Okay, well, that's fine. I mean, if you could, yeah, that's fine. That's fine. So I'm going ahead. Let's actually bring the person in. Yeah, drum roll. And so, round of applause. So for next Sunday, we have Emma. So Emma is coming on the show next Sunday. He's going to tell us all about the Power Virtual Agent and beer. Think about it. Power Virtual Agent and beer. Isn't that interesting? Beer and Power Virtual
Match made in heaven.
So that's gonna be an awesome session. So join us next week. Let's talk about that. But one of the things quickly before we go, Steve, is that the last time I was doing the show on the IoT stuff, they're like, am I making you go into IoT now?
Yes.
It's just that I feel as people in tech, we've evolved to the level that we shouldn't be confined just in what we're doing. Let's even use Dynamics, for example. Immediately after the show, I think he's one of the managers for the Dynamics Connected Field Service team. He immediately connected with me and like, hey Sam, yes, we saw what you did, but do you know you could use a dynamic field service to do that? And I was like, yeah, I have heard about it, but I'm really, giving it a try because I'm still waiting to get my hands on the HoloLens. But it's just to speak to the fact that technology is evolving. And whether we like it or not, our lives are going to be connected one way or the other. Like, for instance, you have IoT connected to it. You have HoloLens now connected to Dynamics. Think about it. Think about having our smartwatches connected to some health system that allows our, primary care physicians to track our vitals and be proactive if something is happening to us. So it's just endless. So I feel that just
Yep.
like you need to learn to code, as we're saying, I think everybody needs a little of IoT in their life. That's just to say.
I think it's great. I wish I had more time to have some Arduino boards and sensors and play around with them. I'd
Yeah.
love to, but I know I would spend way too much time on it.
You would. Thank you once again, Steve. And all too soon, guys, we come to the end of another thrilling episode. Much thanks to Steve for all the awesome time. So make a date with us next Sunday for another episode of the Power Series. But don't forget, Tuesday is IoT Tuesday. Some cool stuff is coming up on the show. So stick and stay with us. Be safe. COVID is real. Share some love. Make sure that whatever you've learned, whatever you've acquired, you can share with people. Together we grow. If we share and we live as one. Thank you very much and have an awesome